When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022, military analysts worldwide agreed that Ukraine was practically bound to lose access to the Black Sea. After all, Ukraine's entire naval forces numbered just one frigate and a handful of patrol boats. On the other side was Russia's formidable Black Sea fleet, consisting of about 80 warships and submarines. Russia was expected to establish total sea control of the area, and it did, for a few months anyway. But here's what nobody saw coming. Ukraine revolutionized naval warfare forever, and in the process, didn't just level the playing field, they completely obliterated Russia's centuries-old naval power. Here are 10 ways Ukraine has emerged as a regional player for control over the Black Sea. This is not just pure conjecture, the numbers support it. By mid-2025, Ukraine had damaged or outright destroyed at least 24 Russian vessels, including the Rostov-on-Don, a Kilo-class submarine. This forced the remainder of Russia's Black Sea fleet to flee to domestic ports where they're essentially useless. We're talking about a total of 30 or so ships and submarines lost, including their flagship, billions of dollars in hardware sent to the bottom of the sea by a country that had no navy. The ones that survived are now used as target practice for Ukraine's emergent long-range naval capabilities. But the numbers only tell us part of this incredible story. What Ukraine pulled off represents the most dramatic naval upset in modern history, and the tactics they pioneered are going to reshape how every future naval conflict is fought. Let's dive into the 10 revolutionary methods Ukraine used to turn Russia's unstoppable Black Sea fleet into a floating embarrassment. The first differentiator, and perhaps the biggest, is that Ukraine was able to do the impossible precisely because it was forced to. Rather than play by Russia's rules, Ukraine needed to reorganize and redevelop its strategies over and over again. This was primarily because Ukraine was waging a highly asymmetric war at sea. And their defensive methods suddenly become much more effective and deadly. This can be summed up in the differences in how Russia and Ukraine handled naval movements. Russian naval doctrine follows classic Soviet-era thinking, massive, coordinated fleet operations directed from central command. This creates powerful but predictable patterns that Ukraine's decentralized intelligence services could anticipate and counter. When you're fighting for your homeland's survival, you don't have the luxury of following traditional naval engagement rules. This creates a decentralized structure that makes it clear that throwing everything you've got at the problem is the right way to go. This resulted in 3 major developments: sea mines, cruise missiles, and naval drones. With the first, Ukraine had a healthy supply of Soviet-era naval mines in storage. Considering that Ukraine knew the most likely coastal invasion points, it strategically laid down hundreds of mines, but the exact numbers are difficult to ascertain. To make things more complicated, Russia would also lay down mines in the coastal waters near Ukraine, largely to prevent trade from coming out of Odessa. This culminated in the Russian Ministry of Defense accusing Ukraine of dropping mines into the deeper waters of the Black Sea, while Ukraine countered by saying that the mines were from Crimean supplies, which were taken over by Russia in the 2014 annexation and were purposefully tampered with to float away from the coast. Regardless of the circumstances, Ukraine managed to block off vital ports of its coastline from Russian ships. With foreknowledge of Russian tactics, Ukrainian sailors could strategically place mines so they made as little impact as possible on their trade ships. In longer ranges, Ukraine leveraged its second major development, the newly re-engineered RK-360MC Neptune coastal defense system, which utilized the R-360 missile with an extended range. This allowed Ukraine to potentially strike targets up to 730 miles away. This, combined with short-range artillery that can work within a few dozen miles of Ukraine's coast, helped them create a vital mine-artillery-missile defensive triangle. But these defensive capabilities pale in comparison to the long-range offensives that were practically invented during the war. Which brings us to the second major way Ukraine pressured Russia's navy: naval drones. Ukraine's deployment of naval drones, and more specifically, drones that were entirely deployed in water, is one of the most rapid military innovations in modern history, one with practical and devastating applications. Starting from literally nothing in early 2022, they created 2 major drone platforms that would terrorize the Russian fleet. The Moskva V-5 drone became Ukraine's precision ship killer. The Moskva is a small, ship-looking drone that has a range of up to 500 miles with 60 hours of battery life, giving it an excellent roaming and loitering capability, considering it can cruise at speeds of around 22 knots or 25 miles per hour. Rounding out the vital statistics is a 440-pound explosive payload that is detonated when the Moskva approaches or even outright rams an enemy vessel. More importantly, it streams live video to operators, meaning that it can be used for both offensive strikes and purely surveillance missions. But the real game changer was the tactical deployment of Moskvas across the Black Sea. As one Ukrainian commander of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine, HUR, said, "We didn't try to strengthen the warhead to destroy the ship with one hit. We took another approach. We attacked in a swarm, carrying out 5 or more hits on large ships to cause critical damage." This positioned Moskva to have a similar role in the sea as the now traditional quadcopter drones have in the sky, but Moskva takes this to the next level with its incredible range, compared to quadcopter drones which might compete with artillery at 12 miles of effective range. While Moskva is the all-rounder, the Sea Baby drone serves as the heavy artillery of Ukraine's naval arsenal. The latest Sea Baby model carries 1,900 pounds of explosives, hits a top speed of 56 miles per hour, and can cover a distance of 620 miles. That's nearly 4 times the explosive payload of a Moskva, designed specifically for devastating static targets like docked ships or even entire shipbuilding infrastructure. Even on the all-rounder front, the Moskva is just a stepping stone for Ukrainian innovations. In June 2024, Ukraine revealed the Stalker 5.0 naval drone, which was essentially a smaller version of the Moskva that is primarily built for naval military transport of equipment, but can be retrofitted with a 330-pound explosive if need be. Due to a slightly smaller cross-section and sleek black hull, the Stalker is made to be much more difficult to detect and counter by Russian forces, evocative of its name. These aren't just remote-controlled boats, they're intelligent weapon systems. Nighttime operations became Ukraine's speciality because thermal imaging and electronic warfare capabilities gave them enormous advantages over Russian visual detection systems. Russian crews fired into the dark water at targets they could barely see, while Ukrainian operators watched high-definition video feeds from hundreds of miles away. Which brings us to the third way Ukraine has stymied Russia's navy. Just when Russian military planners thought they understood Ukraine's naval drone threat, Ukraine rewrote the playbook again by turning boat-based platforms into anti-aircraft weapons. Due to their capabilities of being operated remotely and a generous carrying capacity, the Moskva and the Sea Baby became prime candidates for the installation of machine guns and anti-air missile launchers that can zip around the surface and become much more difficult to spot. The first report of such movements came in May 2024 when a Moskva V-5 destroyed 2 Russian Mi-8 helicopters and damaged another in 3 separate attacks. This was the first reported use of an actual air-to-air missile being launched from an unmanned craft. The missile in question was the Soviet Vympel R-73, codenamed AA-11 Archer by NATO, which is a short-range air-to-air missile more commonly used on the MiG and Sukhoi fighter jets. By adapting the jet launcher to the drone, Ukraine could now effectively use aircraft-based missiles left over from the Soviet Union to directly threaten Russian aircraft far away from its airspace, and all of that without deploying aircraft of its own, which are sorely needed for defensive purposes. But helicopters weren't enough of a target for Ukraine's naval drone industry. In May 2025, around 30 miles west of Novorossiysk, modified Moskva V-5s reportedly shot down 2 Russian Su-30SM fighter jets using AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles in what was claimed to be the first takedown of a jet by a maritime drone. Let that sink in. $50 million fighter jets destroyed by drone boats. And the Sea Baby might be next. The Security Service of Ukraine unveiled the updated version of the Sea Baby in March 2024, where it noted that the drone is particularly important due to its multi-purpose platform capabilities. The upgraded communications systems that rely on Starlink and contain more backups also provide much-needed redundancy and reliability, allowing the Sea Baby to deploy deadly explosives or carry missiles close to Russian ports. When we take all of these into consideration, the offensive and defensive missions, coupled with Ukraine's smart use of mines for deterrence and denial, the country was able to achieve a significant economic victory over Russia and deal the surprising 4th blow to the Russian Navy, restoring Ukraine's maritime trade. Russia's naval blockade was supposed to strangle Ukraine's economy by cutting off maritime exports. For over a year it worked. For context, Ukraine is one of the world's largest grain exporters. Its fertile fields producing wheat and corn, which it exports both overland to its neighbors and over the sea to the rest of NATO and the world, including $2.3 billion worth of grain to China per year. The blockade was borderline catastrophic for Ukraine, a nearly 50% reduction of total exports in March 2022, which only partially stabilized to a 23.7% drop of exports in December 2022 from the same month in the previous year. By autumn of 2023, however, Ukraine was able to export 55 million tons of cargo, and by the end of 2024, Ukraine had achieved nearly 90 million tons of maritime exports. This represents one of the most successful blockade-breaking operations in modern history. The economic implications are staggering. Ukraine's grain exports alone represent almost $10 billion in revenue that fund its war effort. By forcing Russian ships away from Ukrainian shipping lanes, naval drones didn't just win tactical victories, they secured Ukraine's economic survival. The restored export corridor creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Every successful grain shipment funded more drone production, which enabled more attacks on Russian ships, which further secured the shipping lanes. Russia's blockade strategy backfired spectacularly, turning into a catalyst for Ukrainian innovation rather than an economic surrender. This cemented Russia's inability to blockade a much smaller and trade-dependent nation, paving the way for a full restoration of Ukraine's maritime trade. All of these efforts would likely be for naught if Ukraine didn't manage to score one key victory fairly early in the war and deliver the fifth blow to the Russian Navy, sinking the Russian Black Sea flagship Moskva, the Russian endonym for Moscow. The destruction of the Moskva was the defining moment when the world realized Russia's navy wasn't invincible. This wasn't just another ship, it was the pride of the Black Sea Fleet and the third largest active warship of the entire navy. The vessel's onboard defense systems and ability to operate from more than 60 miles off Ukraine's coast seemed to make it virtually impervious to attack. Russian naval doctrine assumed that sophisticated air defense systems would protect high-value assets from Ukrainian threats. But in April 2022, the Ukrainians managed to pinpoint the Moskva's location via a combination of radar and intelligence information shared by the US. A shore-based missile battery then launched two Ukrainian-built R-360 Neptune anti-ship missiles that destroyed the Moskva by igniting its ammunition. These are the same missiles that were deployed for coastal defenses only 2 years before, forming a part of the aforementioned mine missile artillery defense. Even worse, subsequent military analysis suggested that Moskva's supposedly impervious air defense systems, which should have been more than up to the task of taking out two singular missiles, were in a state of disrepair and terribly mismanaged, which allowed for the attack to destroy the ship in the first place. This was Russia's first loss of a flagship since the 1904–05 Russo-Japanese War, and it was also the largest warship sunk in battle since World War II. The loss forced Russia into a fundamental tactical reorganization. Without their command and control flagship, coordinating fleet operations became exponentially more difficult. Russia's rigid, hierarchical naval structure couldn't adapt quickly to losing its central coordination hub, creating cascading operational problems throughout its Black Sea operations. This revealed the sixth way the Russian Navy was in trouble, though not directly attributable to Ukraine: internal issues. Russia's naval failures in the Black Sea go far deeper than tactical defeats. The Russian Navy suffers from chronic underfunding, rampant corruption, and a geographic isolation that Ukraine exploited brilliantly. While Russia technically operates numerous ships across the Baltic, Arctic, and Pacific fleets, Turkey can invoke provisions of the 1936 Montreux Convention to close the Black Sea to incoming warships, which includes Russian warships that are not native to the Black Sea fleet. This means Russia cannot reinforce its Black Sea losses with ships from other fleets, only from ships whose home ports are designated to be on the Black Sea itself. It leaves Russia to apply pressure to Ukraine with only a fraction of its naval capacities. And corruption has devastated Russian naval procurement and maintenance in that part. Ships that could be operational are often in repair, lacking spare parts, or suffering from substandard maintenance due to budget theft. Even worse, Russia has seemingly made no effort to rectify the ongoing losses and bolster the Black Sea fleet. The Jamestown Foundation issued a report on Russia's shipbuilding corporation, which recorded hundreds of millions of dollars in net losses despite billions of reported revenues. Furthermore, the report suggests that Russia is still devoted to modernizing its fleet and spreading its efforts to modernize ships with more cruise missiles and efficient diesel engines. These are countrywide efforts that also target the Baltic and Pacific branches of the Navy, despite them having no short-term relevance in the war in Ukraine. Furthermore, Turkey's restrictions on Russian shipping have forced Moscow to rely on shadow fleets for military transport even through the Black Sea, creating additional vulnerabilities that Ukrainian intelligence services can exploit. This drastically increases the risks and costs of conducting trade, which can be deadly when you're already siphoning extreme amounts of funding to the military-industrial complex, as Russia's military budget for 2025 is roughly 40% of government spending. The downfalls of Russia's ability to maintain its fleet in the Black Sea and, more importantly, to keep it located in the Black Sea itself, led to Ukraine using the seventh method to destroy the Navy: precision strikes on infrastructure. In June 2025, Ukraine launched its third attack on the vital Crimea, or Kerch, bridge since the start of the invasion in 2022. This time, the Ukrainian military agency reported planting over 2,000 pounds of explosives at the base of the bridge. The bridge attacks serve multiple strategic purposes beyond infrastructure damage. As well as serving a vital supply line for Moscow's troops, the Crimean Bridge also has huge symbolic value for President Vladimir Putin, embodying his objective to bind the Ukrainian peninsula to Russia. But the real strategic impact comes from forcing Russian naval assets into defensive roles. Instead of projecting power against Ukrainian positions, Russian ships must now protect their own bases, supply lines, and critical infrastructure. This defensive reorientation fundamentally changes the naval balance of power. For one, the Crimean Bridge is one of the only connections the Crimean Peninsula has to the rest of Russia, discounting the occupied parts of Donbass, which are constantly under Ukrainian long-range attacks. The bridge's vulnerability would force Russia to rely on slower, riskier overland supply lines. But even more importantly, the inherent risk to Crimean infrastructure leads to the eighth way Ukraine can degrade Russia's fleet, forcing it to abandon Sevastopol. Sevastopol was technically the HQ of Russia's Black Sea Fleet since the time Russia was an empire. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the HQ moved to Novorossiysk, but even then, Russia paid Ukraine to port its ships in Sevastopol. When Crimea was annexed, Sevastopol once again became the center point of Russia's fleet. Sevastopol's strategic value cannot be overstated. It provided Russia with optimal positioning to control the western Black Sea and threaten Ukrainian coastal operations. The port's extensive facilities built up over centuries, established supply lines, and defensive infrastructure made it the ideal base for projecting naval power. However, Ukraine's development of long-range naval drones like the Moskva and the Sea Baby potentially puts any ship or building in the Sevastopol naval base at risk. This forced Russian ships to retreat to ports like Novorossiysk, Temryak, and Taganrog over 60 miles from the Ukrainian coast. The Black Sky Intelligence Service provided detailed imagery of ruined buildings and empty docks in Sevastopol, while its AI-enhanced analysis suggested an 18% drop in the ships detected in the port between 2022 and 2024. This geographical displacement fundamentally degrades Russian naval capabilities. Operating from Novorossiysk instead of Sevastopol increases fuel consumption, reduces patrol time near Ukrainian waters, and complicates logistical support. Ships spending more time in transit have less time for operational missions. By spring 2024, Britain's Defense Ministry declared that the Russian Black Sea Fleet had become functionally inactive. That's not damaged or reduced, but functionally inactive. Ukraine didn't just beat the Russian Navy, they made it strategically irrelevant. The way this was done leads us to point number 9. Ukraine's success stems from embracing distributed innovation, while Russia remained trapped in centralized, bureaucratic development cycles that couldn't match the pace of wartime adaptation. Ukraine created a distributed network of over 500 suppliers, ranging from major companies to literal garage workshops, all while under the pressure of daily bombardments. This isn't how traditional military procurement works, but traditional procurement takes years, whereas Ukraine didn't have years if it wanted to survive as a sovereign country with its post-2014 borders intact. The Delta Information System became Ukraine's force multiplier, allowing rapid coordination between diverse development teams as well as military operations. When one workshop discovers an improvement, that information gets shared across the entire network within days, not months. This iterative development cycle means Ukrainian drones evolve constantly while Russian countermeasures lag. The first Ukrainian boats were cobbled together with parts from jet skis, motorboats, and off-the-shelf electronics. Within months, manufacturers working for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry fielded several designs, such as the Moskva and the Sea Baby. Russian military contractors faced the opposite environment: centralized control, lengthy approval processes, and chronic underfunding that forces them to accept below-market payments. This forces companies into cutting corners to make products that just barely work, which more often than not blow up in their faces like one of Wile E. Coyote's inventions against the Roadrunner. And the corruption plaguing Russian defense contractors creates additional delays and quality problems. For every military contract signed, someone is taking a cut and putting it into their own pocket while reporting overinflated production figures. This leaves military planners to coordinate attacks with inventory that's not actually there to begin with, making some operations non-starters. And finally, the 10th way Ukraine is destroying the Russian Navy: the foreign influence in the form of NATO donations. European support for Ukraine's naval innovations has created a positive feedback loop, where every investment produces returns far exceeding what European nations could achieve spending the same money domestically. United 24, a government crowdfunding organization that elicits donations from companies and individuals worldwide, collects the funding. Though the Sea drones aren't cheap, with each Moskva costing around $250,000 and the new Sea Baby model around $221,000, they can damage or sink a ship worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That funding would have gone to domestic national defense, where it would get siphoned on production, procurement, bureaucracy, maintenance, and then offloading obsolete and unused inventory 30 years later if NATO never actually gets attacked. European nations have provided not just funding but complete naval platforms, training, and intelligence support. This comprehensive backing allows Ukraine to punch far above its weight class. At the same time, European military partners get invaluable real-world testing of asymmetrical naval warfare concepts, equipment prototypes, and reports of what works and what doesn't in a drone-saturated battlefield. For instance, sea drone victories in the Russia-Ukraine war could give military planners in the Pentagon fresh ideas about how a Taiwan defense might be conducted. Should a China-Taiwan war erupt, dozens of naval drones might be waiting off the coast, both above and under the water. This kind of innovation is something that was inconceivable before 2022. When this war ends, military academies worldwide will teach Ukrainian naval tactics and point to it as a moment asymmetric warfare definitively proved that innovation beats numbers, that desperation breeds genius, and that the future of naval combat belongs to whoever can adapt fastest. Thanks for watching, and if you want to learn how much Russia has actually lost in the war, check out this video. And to stay up to date with the war in Ukraine or global conflicts, subscribe to The Military Show for daily analyses.